Throughout the centuries, there have been scholars who have been fascinated with persuasion and who have studied the art of persuasion. Aristotle, the father of rhetoric, said that rhetoric is the art of finding all available means of persuasion. And Aristotle said that there are three ways in which we do this. We do this through ethos, logos, and pathos. And so because we're diving into persuasive speaking, I want us to learn a little bit about what ethos, pathos, and logos consist of, so that we know what we need to focus on doing or saying or incorporating into our speech in order to be persuasive. So let's start with methods of persuasion, and then we will focus a little bit on organizational patterns so that you are prepared to select your speech topic. So first, the methods of persuasion. So scholars generally agree that listeners are persuaded for essentially one of four reasons, if not all four reasons. The first is because the speaker has high credibility. And with that credibility, the audience is then persuaded to listen to and believe the speaker. This credibility is what Aristotle would call ethos or ethos. We also know that listeners are won over by a speaker's evidence. So we must incorporate credible sources, testimony, examples, statistics into our speech to convince some of our listeners. We also convince our listeners by taking them through the process of reasoning. So we'll learn about the four types of reasoning, or the four forms of reasoning that we can take our audience through in order to agree with us or be convinced. And then we also know that listeners are touched or are persuaded when their emotions are touched by either the speaker's ideas or the speaker's language. These are the methods in which we persuade. And so I want us to spend just a little bit of time diving into each of these, because credibility is ethos. Using evidence and reasoning is logos, and appealing to emotions is pathos. These are the methods, the modes through which we persuade. So first, let's talk about credibility. What is credibility? What does credibility consist of? Credibility consists of the audience's perception of a speaker's competence and their character. These are the two parts of ethos that you need to ensure that you communicate, convey to your audience. Your competence and your credibility. And we know that ethos, right, is Aristotle's term for credibility. In my course, as part of all of our speech outlines, within the introduction, there's a credibility step. And so we've talked a little bit about this already, where you cite some source, you give your expertise, you share that you are passionate about the subject, you are an expert in the subject, you have done research on the subject, and that helps the audience feel comfortable with listening to you. Because remember, the audience is asking themselves, what's in it for me? And why should I listen to this person? And so you need to respond to that in your speech by sharing your credibility. There's three types of credibility. The first is going to be your initial credibility. This is the credibility that's developed prior to your speech as you walk into the room. And we can communicate and develop our initial credibility through our nonverbals, through strong and confident movement, through our attire. You know, I've mentioned previously with students giving their informative speeches, I've had students display great nonverbal credibility through their attire by wearing attire related to their speech. I gave the example of the student who was a diehard Cubs fan. And when he gave his speech informing us of 3 facts you didn't know about the Chicago Cubs, he wore a Chicago Cubs jersey. And so we knew just visually by looking at him, he's a fan and we should listen to him. I had another student who did an informative speech about making pizza. and the steps we should take, demonstrating the steps we should take to make a pizza. And so they wore their Pizza Hut apron and Pizza Hut hat. And so we knew just by looking at them that they were credible. And so there are strategies that you can incorporate, tactics that we can incorporate as we are approaching the lectern, as we are starting our speech, as we walk into the room and start interacting with our audience. There are things we can do to develop our initial credibility. Because that initial credibility is the audience's perception of you and of your credibility before your speech begins. Then we have the derived credibility. And this is produced by everything that you say and do during your speech. So your sources that you cite, the evidence you provide, right? The examples you share, the statistics that you show, the delivery that you have by limiting vocal fillers, by having good vocal variety. So even the things you do during your speech, delivery. So both content and delivery aid our derived credibility. And then there's terminal credibility. So this is the audience perception of you as the speaker at the end of your speech. You know, I've mentioned we want to start our speeches with wow, right? Get our audience's attention. And we want to end with wow, right? Leave them with something powerful. In a lot of ways, whatever you leave your audience with in your persuasive speech should have them motivated, should have them persuaded. And so your audience at the end of your speech should have some good terminal credibility for you, or you should feel like you have good terminal credibility as you conclude and end your speech. There are 3 strategies that we use when we are trying to enhance or increase our credibility. The first, and I've mentioned this before, I'll mention it again, is we explain our competence, right? You as the speaker can enhance your credibility by just explaining your expertise, your intelligence, your experience with the subject matter, with the topic. You also should establish common ground with your audience. And again, this is something that we do in all of our speeches. As part of the introduction step, we have that rapport step, right? That rapport step where we establish common ground by referencing some kind of common experience. And so in our persuasive speech, we need to do that throughout our speech. We need to establish common ground and build rapport with our audience to enhance our credibility, to enhance our ethos. And then finally, speakers can enhance their credibility just by delivering their speeches fluently, expressively, and with conviction. So again, deliver with conviction aids your ethos. And we'll talk about it also aids your pathos. Let's watch an example of someone delivering their speech, and they reference an experience that students most likely have in common. Some kind of related, connected experience. Let's listen.
As we all know, there are many differences amongst the people in this class. But we do have one thing in common. We're all concerned about the quality of the education at this school. And that quality is clearly in danger because of the economic crisis. Budgets are shrinking, student services are disappearing, and we're being crowded out of classes we need to take. Now, there are no easy answers, but one thing that would help solve the problem is an increase in tuition. I don't like it any more than you do, but sometimes you must do what is necessary to maintain the quality of your education.
So here you see that the speaker is using words like we and us and referencing this common experience to build that common ground, to build that rapport. Next, we have logos. So this is Aristotle's name for logical appeals. It's also the use of evidence and reasoning in a speech. Evidence are essentially the supporting materials that you use to prove or disprove something. And again, evidence consists of examples, statistics, testimony, right? It's these supporting materials that we learned to gather and collect using the library resources and the academic databases. We learned how to collect that data. We are continuing to do that in our persuasive speeches. When you are using evidence in your speech, make sure you use specific evidence. What do I mean by specific evidence? I mean specifically stating who your sources are and where those sources are from and what their credentials are. We've talked about citing our sources, right? In our speeches, we must cite our sources verbally, saying things like according to National Geographic, and we've seen some examples of that. We must continue to cite our sources so that we avoid plagiarism, but more so than that, we need to cite specific sources and state their credentials. And that will aid in our evidence being more persuasive. That will enhance our logos. We also should use what we call novel evidence or new evidence. It should not be outdated, it should be recent. And we've learned how to evaluate sources, right? Authorship, sponsorship, and recency. That's important to ensure that it is not outdated. We also are making sure our sources are credible. We're not citing Google or Wikipedia, but we are citing primary sources and experts in the field. And then we're making clear the point of our evidence. When we are presenting evidence, it should be in direct support of a point or a claim that we are making. Let's watch an example of someone using evidence in support of their point.
According to the Governor's Highway Safety Association, last year there were more than 5,000 motorcycle deaths in the United States. That's a jump of 9% from the previous year. If 5,000 people dead doesn't seem like a lot, consider this. Over the past 15 years, motorcycle deaths doubled, while automobile deaths dropped by 23%. Here in Wisconsin alone, 114 people died last year. That's a 34% increase from the year before. Clearly, we're not doing enough to curb the problem. But here in Wisconsin, there's an easy solution. We can save lives simply by requiring that all motorcyclists wear a helmet.
So clearly, this evidence leads to us knowing the problem, identifying the problem, and then here's the solution to that problem. This very clearly was a speech, right, about problems and solutions, and he was using this specific evidence to support the claim that this is a problem. That wearing motorcycle helmets, or people not wearing motorcycle helmets, is a problem. We'll come back to learning more about evidence and logical reasoning, but let's just touch on emotional appeal. So this is what Aristotle referred to as pathos. So emotional appeals are often called motivational appeals because they are intended to make listeners feel something and often motivate listeners to feel something. So to feel anger, to feel sadness, guilt, fear, reverence, all these happiness, pride, all these are feelings that, both positive and negative feelings, we want our audience to feel. And so when we are incorporating strategies to have strong pathos, strong emotional appeals, and to be persuasive, there's some things we should keep in mind. So pathos being Aristotle's name for the emotional appeals that we incorporate into our speech. These are the ways that we do it. The first is we use emotional language. We claim, cite, reference the emotion that we're wanting to elicit from our audience. Emotional appeals are often chock full of specific emotional appeals are often chock full of emotional language, right? Words and phrases that stir up emotions. So think about the powerful creative language you can incorporate to be persuasive and get your audience to feel an emotion. But keep in mind, as we learned before, you as the speaker must claim and name the emotions that you're wanting to elicit or evoke from your audience. Identify what those are, so that you can ethically craft a speech to not only help them feel emotions, but help them resolve those emotions. Or else we are not being ethical in our speech delivery. So, emotional language, emotional appeals that include emotionally charged language. The second way is to generate emotional appeals with vivid examples, right? Vivid descriptions, vivid images. We want to use vivid description. We learned a little bit about that for informative speaking. We want to really enhance it, and it may involve us having to create our own hypothetical examples that are vivid and descriptive. So that's another way we can enhance how we appeal to emotions. And then finally, a third way we can generate emotional appeals is to speak with sincerity and speak with conviction as a part of our delivery. And so you will see we talked about that with ethos. It also is important with pathos. that you speak and deliver your speech with confidence, with sincerity, and with conviction. Let's listen to an example of someone who does a good job appealing to emotions in their speech. See if you can identify specifically what it is that the speaker is saying that causes some emotions to be elicited.
Nathan was only 5 years old when the fever struck him. At first, no one knew what was wrong. No one knew that parasites inside his body had infected his red blood cells. No one knew those cells were clumping together, choking the flow of blood through his body and damaging his vital organs. No one knew his kidneys would soon fail and seizures would begin. No one knew he would wind up in a coma. The parasites in Nathan's body came from a mosquito bite, a bite that gave him malaria. And Nathan is not alone. The World Health Organization tells us the horrible truth. In Africa, a child dies from malaria every 30 seconds.
So here you hear really powerful language, right? Struck, parasites, choking, damaging, fail, horrible, right? These are words that elicit emotions and feelings. You also saw that she delivered her speech with conviction, right? She stood firm and steadfast, spoke deliberately. She also spoke slowly and paused so that you can understand and comprehend what she's saying and reflect on what she is saying. We must make sure that anytime we are using emotional appeals, because they have so much potential power, we must have a strong sense of ethical responsibility in knowing that what we're doing has a powerful effect on people. You know, emotional appeals can be abused by really unscrupulous speakers for really detestable causes. And so we want to make sure that we are staying true to an ethical and moral foundation as we develop our speeches and as we use emotional appeals and our pathos. Emotional appeals can also be used by principled speakers for noble causes. And I would like you to put yourself into that category as an ethical speaker, a principled speaker, speaking to your audience for a noble cause, for your audience's benefit, for your audience to improve or for their good and prosperous future. We must make sure that our emotions that we elicit from our audience are appropriate to the speech topic, right? So we must, again, name and claim and identify the emotions that we're trying to elicit and ensure that that's appropriate for our subject matter or for the topic that we are speaking about. We also must make sure that we never substitute evidence and reasoning with just pure emotional appeals, right? We never substitute evidence and reasoning, the logos, with just pathos. To do so would be unethical. So we must ensure that if we are using pathos and those emotional appeals, that we also have logos, the evidence in that reasoning. We've had speakers throughout history who have been very skilled at developing and presenting and delivering speeches that are pure pathos, pure emotion, that stir up feelings of joy and pride or feelings of fear. And so we must make sure we are in the category that stirs up feelings and emotions for a good purpose, for a noble cause, and never substitute logos for just pure pathos. Never rile up your audience, get them feeling all these emotions without providing evidence and logical reasoning. So now let's dive into logos and logical reasoning. I want to share with you the types of logical reasoning and how we use them to construct arguments. And I'll give some examples. And then I'll share with you just briefly some fallacies that we should make sure to avoid. So first, when you are developing your persuasive speech in this class, you are making a claim. You are making a claim on something that is debatable. So you should choose a position and take a position on most likely something that's controversial. So you take a side in a controversy and you are essentially inviting debate on this by presenting this to the class. Now, we aren't actually doing a debate, but you should frame it that way because you need to be able to respond to anyone who would then come back and debate you on this controversial topic. The way that we are structuring our speeches is by making claims of either fact, value, or policy. And so I know we've mentioned this before, but just to review a little bit, that we also call these the types of persuasive speeches, or the proposition of, or the question of. But these are essentially the types of persuasive speeches. So the first is that of fact. So trying to convince us that something is true or false, exists or doesn't exist, is real or is fictional. And so if you are trying to convince us of one of those things, it is a persuasive speech of fact, and you are making a claim that something is indeed a fact, something is indeed true. The second is a persuasive speech of value, or where you're making a value claim, or what we'd also say is a value judgment. So you are saying and making the claim, taking the position that something is good or bad, right or wrong, just or unjust, moral or immoral. Or you're placing, like I said, a value judgment on it, or giving some worth to something, saying something is the best, most important, worst, right? Placing a value or some worth on it. When you do this, you make a value judgment, and it is a persuasive speech of value. So in these speeches, you are taking us through the logical reasoning that you have found, the evidence that you have found to support these claims. That it's either true or false, real or fake, right? Exists, doesn't exist, that it is good or bad, right or wrong, just, unjust, right? Making a value judgment. The claim of policy is a little bit different because, again, as we've learned with claim of policy, we are proposing a plan or a path forward. We're stating what should be and presenting the steps that take us there. And we see this a lot specifically in our governmental organizations where they're presenting policy, right? They're sharing with us the steps that we need to take to complete something, a process, or to accomplish a specific goal. So as we have mentioned previously, and I'll mention again, there are three parts of this. The first is we need to establish the need for this policy. So what's the problem? What is the issue that this policy is intended to resolve? We then lay out the plan that we propose, for which is the policy. And then we must also recognize that we should state and clarify how realistic it is, how practical it is, how reasonable it is. Because some of our audience members are going to ask that, really, is this practical? Is this really realistic? Can we really do this? So knowing your audience, some in your audience are going to ask those questions. You need to be prepared to respond to that in your speech, in your persuasive speech, where you make a claim of policy. So you make these claims of either fact, value, or policy. You're then using evidence like statistics, examples, testimony, other support to bolster, to support your claim. You also are considering criteria or standards that support your evaluation. So you've already gone through these steps and reached this conclusion, right? You've already reached a decision on this topic that you are persuading us to join you in agreeing with you or reaching that same conclusion. And so take us through the steps that convinced you to take that position. Reflect on rules, principles, or standards employed in the judgments that you have made to reach that conclusion. You must also provide sufficient qualitative and quantitative data or quantitative evidence. So qualitative evidence are going to be those examples, those stories, those narratives, those quotes. The quantitative evidence are going to be the statistics, right? The numbers that you use to support your points. And essentially, you're trying to convince reasonable people, right? We're not trying to convince anyone in the extremes, anyone who's considered on the fringe. We are convincing normal, reasonable, what we call reasonable people of this choice, of this decision to agree with us in this way. We can test our evidence by ensuring that it's good quality, that it is relevant, that there's a good solid amount of it, and we can dive more into that next time. We must also provide proof. We have the burden of proof when we are doing a persuasive speech. Specifically, if you are advocating for a new policy that you want us to do or that you want to be established, again, you specify the need, you present the plan, and then you are then providing proof that this plan is feasible, that is practical, that it's workable. So specifically for persuasive speech as a policy, you must do those three things because you have the burden of proof. You have the responsibility to provide the evidence in support of the claim that you are making. Now I want to transition to the forms of reasoning, or what we'd also call the types of reasoning. If you've taken a logic class or a rhetoric class or a debate class, this may look familiar. I just want to go through the basics and just give some very simple examples. Some of my examples are simple, they're not necessarily speech related, but they're related to this logical reasoning process that we do. This is part of how we learn, this is part of how we grow, and this is part of how we persuade in our everyday lives. So we have reasoning from specific instance or inductive reasoning, we have reasoning from principle, which is deductive, we have causal, and then analogical. So first, let's start with reasoning from specific instances. This is going to be where you move from particular facts to a general conclusion. Because of these list of facts, I have reached this conclusion. And this is probably going to be at least one of the types of reasoning that you all do in your speech. Again, logos consists of evidence and reasoning, and you're providing evidence in support of the reasoning, the logical reasoning that you are doing. So you're providing specific examples, not generalized examples, specific examples that then allow you to reach a general conclusion. The number of examples is important. You must provide your audience with sufficient number of examples to ensure that you don't commit the fallacy of hasty generalizations. That is going to be where you don't provide enough examples to then support the claim that you are making or the conclusion that you have reached. Your claims must be carefully qualified. You must provide us those specific sources and ensure that each claim you make is supported by evidence. Here's my simple example. My PE course last term was easy. My roommate's PE course was easy. My brother's PE course was easy. Therefore, my conclusion is all PE courses are easy. Now, if I were to present this in a speech, I would need to provide some evidence. What was my experience with my PE course? What specifically about it do I feel made it easy? I would interview my brother and his roommate to see what they said about their PE courses that led to them feeling like it was easy. I might need to collect some additional sources like curriculum guides, right, or syllabi that then help me display, hey, this isn't necessarily as rigorous. Now, I'm not saying PE courses are not easy. Some PE courses can be quite challenging, but again, in this example, we are reasoning from a specific instance. When you are reasoning from a specific instance, you must avoid those hasty generalization, that hasty generalization fallacy. You must qualify your argument, I say when necessary, but anytime you make a claim and you're providing us examples in support of that claim, you must make sure you qualify that clearly for your audience. And then you reinforce your arguments with those statistics and testimony. The next type of reasoning, and again the text goes into more detail about these, so I won't go into a ton of detail, I'm just hitting the highlights. So the next is reasoning from principle or deductive reasoning. So moving from a general principle to a specific conclusion. So you're drawing a conclusion about a specific case based on a generally accepted premise. And so it's usually from qualified premises to probable conclusions. So the conclusion you're reaching isn't necessarily certain, but you're getting us to this conclusion based on the major premise and the minor premise. The premises often are already accepted by the audience. The speaker may assume the audience will fill in a missing premise, and we call that rhetorical syllogism. But again, it's helpful, I think, to fill in the blanks for your audience and provide both your major and minor premise. A skeptical audience is going to require evidence in support of the premises that you state. Here's a classic example of that. Major premise, all people are mortal. Minor premise, Socrates is a person. Conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. The major premise is something just about everybody would accept, that all people are mortal, we don't live forever, right? The minor premise, we must identify and provide evidence in support of Socrates being a person. And then because Socrates is a person and all people are mortal, Socrates is mortal. So this process of reasoning from principle is one that you may want to incorporate into your persuasive speech. You should use a major premise that your listeners are going to accept, that's widely accepted, and you must provide evidence in support of the minor premise, the minor claim that you are making. Next, we have causal reasoning, which we have a causal organizational pattern, which is similar, right? We're essentially dealing with causes and effects. And that's what causal reasoning does, is you are establishing a relationship between causes and effects in support of a claim or a conclusion. You are going from either effect to cause or cause to effect. So you can go either direction. And this is really the heart of scientific investigation, right? We usually see the symptoms of something and then are going back trying to determine the cause that led to those symptoms or those effects. And that is medical science. That's what we do going through the scientific process. My example of causal reasoning is very simple. Because that patch of ice was there, I fell and broke my arm. Patch of ice led to broken arm. Cause and effect. When we are giving the causal organizational or causal reasoning, we're taking our audience through causal reasoning, we must avoid the fallacy of false cause, which is where our cause doesn't really, or our effect doesn't really stem from the cause that we say it does. We should also not assume that events only have one cause. Events can be caused by multiple things, right? Multiple factors can lead to certain effects. And then the last type of reasoning is analogical reasoning. This is going to be where you compare two similar cases, and what's true for the first case is also true for the second case. And because these cases are essentially alike, we are then making the conclusion that what is true is for the first will be true for the second. So some things to keep in mind with analogical reasoning, right? We're saying what is true in one case will be true in the other. We're using usually literal analogy that comes from these similar examples. We could use figurative analogy, which compares dissimilar examples. These things are not alike, right? We could just say this is metaphorical, but it rarely proves anything. So we should make sure and ensure that what we are stating really makes sense to our audience. If we are using analogical reasoning, we should make sure that our literal analogies are compelling and make compelling logical arguments. Our strength of our analogical reasoning relies on the degree of similarity between the cases that we are comparing. And these are frequently used specifically in persuasive speech of policy or policy arguments. Because, for example, if there's a policy I think we should implement here in the state of Illinois, I will probably provide a similar case or see where this policy was implemented in other places, say, hey, it works here, let's make it work there. Here's my example of analogical reasoning. Again, not necessarily speech related, but more reasoning related. If you're good at tennis, you will probably be good at ping pong. We know these are two examples that are similar to each other because tennis, and I would need to qualify what makes tennis and ping pong similar. Well, they're both racket sports. They both involve a racket hitting a ball over a net, right? Although ping pong is a smaller racket, smaller ball, smaller net, the process of playing it and the tools that you use to play it are similar. And because they are similar, I have reached this conclusion. If you're good at one, you're probably good at the other. As we go through these different types of reasoning in our persuasive speeches, we can make errors. And when we make errors, we call those fallacies. fallacies of logic, reasoning, and evidence. So let me share with you just in brief, because the textbook goes into more detail about these. So I'll just share with you briefly the fallacies that I see most commonly in persuasive speeches. The first is going to be those hasty generalizations, not providing enough specific examples to support the conclusion that you've reached. The other is going to be false cause, where the effect that you share doesn't relate or doesn't seem to stem from the cause you say it does. Invalid analogy, where you're taking us through that analogical process and the two cases you're comparing are really just not similar. The bandwagon fallacy, you may have heard of the bandwagon effect, right? Everyone's jumping on the bandwagon because it's popular. That's essentially what the bandwagon fallacy is. It's popular, so it's right, it's correct. And we should be careful of stating that, because that is not always the case. The red herring is where you throw in a distraction, something not related to your speech, or if you're having a political debate, you may divert the topic to something else. So that's throwing in a red herring. We then have ad hominem, which we see more so, I would say, in our political debates, but we also can do them in our persuasive speeches where we do a personal attack. So personal attacks over content of a speech would be considered ad hominem, so a personal attack. The either-or fallacy is where you're forcing the audience to make a decision between two things, either this or that, when there are a variety of choices available. So make sure you don't, what we call, pigeonhole us into a specific choice when there are multiple choices available. Give us all of the choices and then share with us why one of those is most preferable. The slippery slope fallacy is kind of like it sounds. It's essentially saying that certain causes will lead to effects that are worse and worse and worse and take us down this slippery slope to disaster. So we should be careful making those claims without evidence to support it. And then the last two are going to be appeals to tradition or appeals to novelty. So appeals to tradition are saying because something is old, it's better, it's correct, it's the right way to do things. Appeal to novelty just because something is new, right? Something is new, it's fancy, it's shiny, right? So it's better, it's the best, it's the right way to do things, the correct way to do things. So just because something is new does not mean that is the direction we should go. So those are my examples of some fallacies that we tend to make when we are delivering our speeches. And so make sure you are familiar with those. We'll pick up with learning about organizational patterns and the different types of organizational patterns that are out there. So let's take a brief break and then we'll come back to learn about organizational patterns. So when it comes to organizational patterns, we've already learned of the variety of organizational patterns that we have for informative speeches. We have chronological, topical, spatial, cause and effect. We also have problem, solution, and comparative as parts of our informative speech organizational patterns. Just like we have informative org patterns, we have persuasive organizational patterns. So just to review just a bit, we have persuasive speech types, which are going to be of fact, value, or policy. Fact being convincing us, making a claim that something is true or false, exists, doesn't exist, is real, or is fiction. Persuasive speech of value is making a claim that something is good or bad, right or wrong, just or unjust, moral or immoral. Something has value, something has worth, something is the best. Or persuasive speech of policy, where you propose a plan or a path forward, you state what should be, and you present the steps we should take to get there. You present the need that needs to be satisfied, you present the plan to fulfill that need, and then you assure us of the practicality, the realistic, that this plan is realistic and reasonable. Then we have the methods of persuasion, Aristotle's logos, ethos, and pathos. We know that ethos is credibility, and there's a couple types of credibility, competence and character. We have pathos, which are those emotional appeals where we know what emotion we are trying to elicit from our audience. We name that, we claim that, we incorporate examples and language that aid in that pathos, but we do so ethically. Then we have logos, where we're providing evidence and taking our audience through logical reasoning. We can take them through inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, causal reasoning, or analogical reasoning. So we've learned about the types, we've learned about the methods, right? We had informative speech methods where we could describe, define, explain, or demonstrate. So we've got methods. The difference is we're using, in our persuasive speech in this class, we're using all three methods. We're not just choosing one. And now we get to organizational patterns. So I'm just going to touch on briefly the organizational patterns that you should be paying attention to, because you will choose one of these organizational patterns for your persuasive speech. The one that we're not necessarily focusing on is Monroe's motivated sequence, because the way I've designed my outline, we actually kind of do Monroe's motivated sequence anyway, but I'll still reference it, and it's in the textbook so that you're familiar with it as an organizational pattern. So let's start with the direct method. I'll talk about causal, problem solution, Monroe's motivated sequence. Let's start with direct. So this is where you make a claim and then you provide a list of reasons in support of that claim. And each reason must directly support the central claim that you are making. So my example of this is the claim that vegetarianism offers many positive health benefits for people struggling with obesity. 1, it reduces processed food that is consumed. 2, it promotes reflective consumption. And 3, it decreases the likelihood of cancer and heart disease. So I'm making a claim that this is a fact. Vegetarianism offers health benefits. If I was trying to convince you that vegetarianism is the right diet to incorporate into your life, that it is the best diet to incorporate into your life, I am making a value judgment and could take this the direction of a persuasive speech of value. If this was policy, I would share with you a specific plan that you could incorporate to become vegetarian. So in this direct method, I am providing a statement of reasons that directly support my central claim that vegetarianism offers many health benefits. And each reason offers another bit of evidence that vegetarianism is a good option. So first, that it reduces processed food that is consumed. I would define and explain what is processed food, what are some examples of processed food, maybe even cite an expert who can give us an explanation on processing food. Second, promoting reflective consumption. I would define what reflective consumption is. I would provide some data, some statistics maybe in support of this being a good direction to go. And then third, decreases the likelihood of cancer and heart disease. I would definitely provide some statistics, some data from scholarly sources about the vegetarianism's benefits in relationship to cancer and heart disease. So that is my direct method example. The next that we'll learn about is problem solutions. So this is where you list the problems and then list the solutions. You also could list action steps that help us be a part of the solution. This is where your main point, again, documents the solution. Your second main point presents the solution to that problem. We did these, this was a possible option for informative speeches, right? So we learned about this when we learned about informative speaking, but here you are taking the position on some kind of topic where there's opinions on both sides and convincing us that a problem exists and that there's a solution to that problem. My example would be to persuade my audience that the U.S. Congress should pass legislation that will reduce lead levels in the nation's water supply. Because lead in the water supply is a serious problem in the United States, I think Congress at the federal level should pass legislation reducing lead levels on water so that everyone benefits. So my first main point would be outlining how lead in our nation's water supply is a serious problem. Here's the evidence to support that, the testimony, right? The examples, the statistics to support that. And then second, here is the solution to that. Now, I'm not necessarily presenting a specific plan, but I could just say, here are the things that we should do to actually improve this problem. If I was presenting, so if I'm trying to convince you that a problem exists, it's a persuasive speech of fact. If I'm trying to convince you that this is bad, this is wrong, it is immoral that it is still a problem, that is a persuasive speech of value. If I'm presenting a specific plan, a specific policy that we should enact to solve this problem, persuasive speech of policy. Next, we have a causal pattern. Similar to the causal organizational pattern where we present a cause, causal reasoning, where we are making that connection between causes and effects, we have an organizational pattern where we are just doing that. We are presenting a cause and the effects, or causes that lead to an effect. You could make a value judgment and share what are the positive or negative effects that result from some kind of cause. So we can, again, go a variety of directions. We can state that this indeed exists as a problem, or this cause exists, or these effects exist. We could say that this is good or bad, right or wrong, moral or immoral, and make a value judgment. Or we can present a specific plan to reach maybe some positive effects, or to reduce some negative effects. So this could be positive, like exercising, right? Here's some positive effects, some positive benefits to exercising and the steps you can take. Maybe 3 exercises you should do to reduce heart disease. So my example is a persuasive speech of fact. So I'm sharing this because I want to convince you that this is a problem, that for a fact marijuana criminalization has destroyed families. That is the claim that I'm making. The cause that led to marijuana criminalization destroying families is that these laws were passed that criminalized marijuana. These laws caused some effects. The first effect being that law enforcement targeted specifically men of color, and the second being that there was an increased incarceration rates that separated fathers from their families. Because of those 2 reasons, families were destroyed. So if I'm trying to convince you that this problem exists, that this problem is true, it is a persuasive speech of fact. If I'm saying that these laws were immoral, they were wrong, they were unjust, then that is a persuasive speech of value. If I'm presenting a specific plan to resolve this problem, to change and have positive effects, then it would be a persuasive speech of policy. The next cause and effect example I have is a fun one, I think, the persuasive speech of fact, convincing you that NASA funding led to new inventions, that this is true, that this exists, that this is real. This is not fiction, that what they've created has been pretty cool. So the cause is NASA was founded. The founding of NASA to explore space led to the creation of inventions that have benefited our society. Specifically Velcro, aluminum foil, and Capri Sun. So if I'm trying to convince you that, again, this is true, this exists, this is real, it's persuasive speech of fact. If I'm trying to convince you that this is immoral, that NASA has actually lost funding, it's wrong that NASA has lost funding, that NASA can no longer be a benefit to society because they've lost funding, and this is bad, this is wrong, this is unjust, then I would be doing a persuasive speech of value. If I had a specific plan, right, I presented a need, present a plan, and share that I believe it's realistic and why I believe it's realistic, it would be a persuasive speech of policy. So we also have a problem cause solution, which is kind of a hybrid between problem solution and cause and effect. This is where our main point documents the problem, our second point analyzes the cause of that problem, and our third main point presents a solution to that problem. My example of a problem cause solution will be to persuade my audience that action is required to deal with the problem of childhood obesity. Childhood obesity is a serious problem, I think, that can be controlled with changes in diet and exercise. And so my example of that is, first main point, childhood obesity is a major problem in the U.S. Here's my evidence for that being a problem. Second, I believe there are 2 major causes of the increase in childhood obesity, and so here are those causes that have led to this problem. And then my third main point, here is the solution. Solving the problem requires dealing with both of these causes. Here's an example of problem cause solution.
Now that we have a sense of the seriousness of childhood obesity, let's look at the causes of the problem. The first cause is dietary. Simply put, kids are eating too much food of the wrong kind. They overconsume sugar and saturated fat, and underconsume fruits, vegetables, fiber, and micronutrients. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services reports that fast food consumption among adolescents has increased 500% since 1970. Per capita consumption of soft drinks has increased from 179 grams per day to 520 grams per day among boys, and close to that much among girls.
So here's that example of problem, cause, solution. We also have comparative advantages. This is where each point explains why one solution is preferable to the other. So we had a comparative organizational pattern for informative speeches, but here we are presenting or comparing multiple options and sharing why one is the best or the most preferable option. So my example would be to persuade my audience that our city should build a rapid bus system instead of a new highway. This was a big debate in my hometown where I grew up because we didn't have a reliable transit system. And so I believe a rapid bus system will be cheaper and more efficient than a new highway, and I'm going to provide the evidence in support of that. So there are research models that show that we'll save $1 million if we build a rapid bus system instead of a new highway. And there are research models that also show that a rapid bus system will reduce traffic congestion more than a new highway. And that was the original problem that we were trying to solve. So next and last is Monroe's motivated sequence. I won't dive into this one as much because it's explained in your text, and we're not going to use it specifically in this class, but I want you to be familiar with it. Because it is a 5-step sequence that essentially spurs and encourages our audience to seek immediate action. So first is we gain attention. Second is we show a need for change. We then provide a solution that satisfies that need. And then here's the powerful part. We visualize, right? By implementing this specific solution, here is how the world will be better. This is how we will see more positive results as a result of this solution. And then we urge our audience to go out and be a part of the action. So my example would be to persuade my audience to take class notes by hand instead of on a computer. You can learn a lot more and get better grades if you take class notes by hand rather than with a computer. So if I was giving this speech, I guarantee you there's a lot of you, I would need to provide clear evidence in support of these points. So my attention step. Many of us use a computer to take notes in lectures and other classes. Through this attention step, I am not only gaining attention, but I'm building rapport and establishing common ground with my audience. Despite the popularity of computers, using them to take class notes can reduce learning. Here is the clear documentation of that issue. Again, I don't necessarily take this position, but it nonetheless is just giving you this example. Satisfaction. If you can avoid these problems by taking notes by hand, you will be able to learn more. And then visualization. Taking notes by hand will improve your learning and your grades. Here are the positive results from implementing this change to taking notes by hand. And so I encourage you to leave your laptop at home and put pen to paper instead. So that is example of Monroe's motivated sequence. I will post on the Learning Management System this video, which is a persuasive speech, a problem solution speech in regards to lead in the drinking water. And so it's a powerful example and a good example of actually what you should be doing in your persuasive speeches. I'll also post this example of Monroe's motivated sequence so you can get an idea for each of those steps of Monroe's motivated sequence. So that wraps up everything that I wanted to share with you in regards to persuasive speaking. So in this class, if you haven't already, you should be selecting your speech topic or your speech subject by posting it to the Learning Management System discussion board. And what you are doing is you are essentially completing the preparation stage of your outline, of the outline template. So if you remember, on the outline template, we have the preparation stage, we have the introduction, body, and the conclusion. So you should make sure that you are completing at least the preparation stage to prepare you to go out and do research and preparation for your speech. So the first are going to be the types. So what type of speech are you going to choose? You do one of those three. The next is you're going to be incorporating all these types of persuasive methods. And so you should ensure that as you are doing research, you are referencing ethos, pathos, and logos and incorporating these concepts into the body of your speech. And you should be selecting one organizational pattern. Again, this is the order of your main points. Are you going to do it direct, problem, solution, cause and effect, problem, cause, solution, comparative advantages? What order are you going to present the information in the body of your speech? Then, after you make those choices with your preparation stage, you move forward with writing the body of your speech, right? You then write out your main points, your supporting points, you write those transition statements. Now that I've talked to you about point 1, let me talk to you about point 2. That helps your speech flow. You're inputting that information. Once you've got that done, you write the introduction, right? You've got the attention step, the rapport step, the credibility step, the preview step. You're previewing your main points. You got to know your main points before you preview your main points. So then you write your introduction, then you write your conclusion. You say, in conclusion, you then write your review, which mirrors your preview. So your preview is today I'm sharing with you this, these main points. And your review today I shared with you these main points. And then you're leaving us with some kind of memorable closing. And that's what you should be working on. We will have an opportunity for you to share that with me as a draft so that I can review that and give you feedback on that. You get all the points just for submitting your draft, right? It just allows me to see the direction you're going and give you some feedback. So try to make that draft as complete as possible. I'll give you feedback on it as well as all your points for that assignment. And then you'll take that draft and you'll continue to enhance it and build it into a full sentence outline. And it's that full sentence outline with references, with sources properly cited, that you will then insert into the learning management system. You'll submit that for a grade, and you'll then take pieces of that, put it on your note cards, and deliver it as a speech in class. So if you have any questions as you're working on that, let me know. Feel free to email me or text me. Thank you. See you all next week.